All right. Welcome to the Beef Cattle Research Council's webinar on climate change. My name is Stacey Domalewski. I'm the Science and Extension Coordinator for the BCRC, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Our session is going to last for approximately 1 hour, but it could go a little longer depending on the questions you have during the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet along with us tonight using hashtag BeefWebinar. We will be recording this session, and I'll be emailing out a link to the recording to everyone who registered in a couple of days. So if you miss hearing anything or want to watch it again, you can. So just a reminder that you'll be able to hear and see tonight's presenters, but we can't hear or see you. So if you want to communicate with us, just type into the small chat window in the control panel on the side of your screen. If you have a question for our presenter tonight, you can also include it there, but I'll read it at the end. But feel free to send them in at any time. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it may help to close any other programs that are using the internet, as well as close the webcam window. This means you're not going to be able to see us, but it'll hopefully make the audio come through a bit more clearly and get the slides to load a little faster. All right, so with what we're going to be covering tonight, we're going to be starting, we'll hear from Virgil Lowe about the Canadian Beef Industry Conference, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Kim Ominski, who will be talking about climate change and is the cattle industry prepared. As I mentioned, I'll open it up to questions, and then I have some closing remarks for you. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker of the night. So Virgil is the chair of the Canadian Beef Industry Conference, and he has a message for you. All right, so you should be able to share your screen now, Virgil. There we go.
Perfect, thank you, Stacey. And I will try and keep this brief because I will be the uninteresting part of the evening. As Stacey mentioned, I'm the chair of the 2017 conference, and I was also fortunate enough to be the co-chair of the 2016 conference. So for those of you who couldn't make it last year, I will just do a brief recap to run over what happened last year and what we hope to expect for next year. So this picture is from the opening night reception. We frankly had way more people than we expected. We had about 640 full conference registrants, over 60 industry sponsors and partners of varying degrees, and as you may or may not be able to see from this picture, a strong contingent of young people at the conference. So we were very happy with our turnout and results from last year. We were also fortunate to have very strong speakers at the conference. As you can see here, these are all the people listening to the morning sessions. And one of my favorite highlights for the conference is I think you could have heard a pin drop in that room during any of those sessions, which was excellent. That morning involved speakers focusing on a couple of the pillars of the National Beef Strategy, including productivity. And then the afternoons generally involved hearing from more detailed speakers on specific parts of each pillar, including your presenter tonight. So it was a very good speaking roster and informative event. Of course, there wasn't all speakers and learning. This was a picture from the banquet on the Wednesday night, where we were fortunate to present a couple of beef industry awards. One being the Environmental Stewardship Award, presented to Miles and Sherry Anderson, and another being the Canadian Beef Industry Award for research, awarded to Outstanding Achievement in the Research Field, presented to Dr. Tim McAllister. So on to 2017. Our theme for 2017 is sharing common ground. We hope that this can capture the two goals of the conference, the first to be the meeting place of the Canadian beef industry, and the second to promote the importance of sharing the story of beef production with the world. We hope that's captured in sharing common ground by sharing the ground both between ourselves as different segments in different parts of the industry, and sharing it between industry members and the public itself. The conference this year will be held in Calgary, and our venue will change to be the Calgary Stampede, the BMO Center on Stampede Park. We're looking forward to the opportunities we can have there with the increased space primarily, and the close proximity of our host hotel, the Hyatt Regency downtown. The theme there is really Western, and we're really looking forward to an enjoyable event there. An added benefit of the Stampede that's not common in many conferences is the ability to use the Agrium Western Event Center. So we're hoping to be able to put some really exciting programming in there for the attendees of 2017. Lastly, this is just a bit of pertinent information. Obviously, August 15th to 17th is a long ways away. This is our save the date, so please mark that down and keep an eye on the website seen below there, or our Twitter and Facebook pages for updates on when registration will be happening. That is all we have for the conference, so hope everyone enjoys the rest of the webinar.
All right, thanks, Virgil. Yeah, as he said, hopefully we will see you there. And as Virgil mentioned, tonight's presenter was also speaking at the conference. So I would like to introduce to you Dr. Kim Ominski. Kim is a professor and researcher at the University of Manitoba. Since joining the university, a decade ago, Kim has established a research program exploring the productivity and sustainability of beef cattle production in Western Canada. This work includes identification of greenhouse gas mitigation strategies conducted in collaboration with a multidisciplinary team of researchers from across Canada. So Kim, you should be able to share your screen now.
How's that, Stacy?
Good. So we can't see you yet, so if you can share your webcam, that would be great.
Yep.
Perfect.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Stacy, and thank you for the opportunity to once again deliver this presentation. I'd like to begin by saying that this presentation is really the compilation from a number of scientists from the University of Manitoba and actually across Canada, and it was part of a document that was put together for our Alberta Institute of Agrologists. So I'm going to start by asking the question, what do we know about the cattle industry? And what do we know about climate change? Stacy, I can't advance my slide.
Okay. So Kim, if you just go to your actual, if you click on your actual presentation.
Yep.
And that's not working. Maybe what I'll get you to do, sorry everybody, technical difficulties. Can you minimize your presentation and then pull it back up again? Okay, try and present it again.
Okay.
And now are you able to?
We're ready. Yep, fantastic. Thanks so much, Stacy. Okay, so I'm going to start with the question of what do we know? We know that population change is going to occur. We expect that global population will increase to 9 billion people by 2050, and that means that more food is needed. We also know that there's an expected 3% increase per year in per capita income. What do we know about the climate? So this graph shows that, over the course of time, we've seen an increase in temperature, and that increase in temperature has increased dramatically in the last number of years, with 2015 being the warmest year on record. We know that humans will continue to warm the Earth, with the largest changes occurring after the year 2050. And this graph shows sort of two climate change scenarios. The blue zone would be sort of the optimistic perspective in terms of how we expect warming to continue to increase, and the red zone is the more pessimistic with much larger increases in temperature. So Stacey, I'm going to ask you now if you can start with our first question from the poll.
For sure. So the poll questions for everybody, shortly you'll be seeing a question on your screen. This is your opportunity to participate in tonight's webinar. So we'll have them throughout the webinar. So you can see the question came up now. Just click the answer that you think applies. Your answers here are anonymous to everybody else on the webinar. So the question tonight, which of the following are sources of greenhouse gases? Methane from digestion of feed, nitrous oxide from manure and fertilizers, soil carbon loss from annual crops, or all of the above? So I'll just give everybody a couple more seconds to get your answers in. All right. So it looks like it was pretty unanimous here. About 3% said nitrous oxide from manure and fertilizers, and 97%, or the rest, said all of the above.
So in fact, that's true that when we think about where greenhouse gases come from, they come from agricultural production systems. They certainly come from digestion of feed, nitrous oxide from manure and fertilizers, and soil carbon loss as a consequence of annual crops. Globally, we know that agriculture is responsible for about 10% of emissions. And obviously, if we're able to decrease emissions, it lowers the impact and reduces the need for adaptation. So in Western Canada, historically, we know that most of the warming has been occurring in the winter, and that's if we look at the temperature data from 1950 to 2010. And in addition to warmer winter temperatures, we've also seen less snowfall. So we can ask, what about the prairie agroclimate, which is sort of a subset of the prairie climate? We know, of course, that it's highly variable among years and throughout the season at any given location. And what I've shown here is over a 50-year time frame. If you look at the frost-free period, and this happens to be for Winnipeg, the date of the last spring frost has varied anywhere from about the 1st of May till the middle of June. So that's about a 6-week time frame. In addition to the high variability that we see, for example, in spring frost, we of course see high variability in precipitation. So if we look at sort of climate trends on the prairies, typically we can say that prairie production is limited by heat and it's limited by water. We see small increases in frost-free period and heat units, but there's high year-to-year variability, which often masks very obvious trends. And I've just given 2 examples here. One of them is the 213 bumper crop, which has had very favorable moisture for many areas, and in 215, the fewest number of sunny days, much of which is due to forest fires. So in general, we can say that areas of Western Canada are in a water deficit for crops, but excess moisture has been the greatest insurance risk in several areas over the last decade. What do we expect to see in 2050? We expect to see annual temperature increase between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius with reduced heat limitations for many crops, which is beneficial, but perhaps increased water limitations as well. Increases in extreme weather-related events. We can ask ourselves about the 2013 flood in Alberta. Was that, as a consequence of climate change? Certainly, we expect that Canada would be, mostly insulated from some of the big climatic effects, which might occur to a much greater extent elsewhere in the world. So, what are the challenges and opportunities for the cattle industry? One of the most significant changes that we've seen in management of cattle over the last decade is a shift from confinement of cattle during the winter period to use of extended grazing strategies. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Stacey once again to ask the question about where have we seen the greatest change?
All right. So as Kim mentioned, our next question for you. So which region do you think has the greatest increase in winter grazing? So is that Atlantic Canada, Eastern Canada, the Boreal Shield, or on the prairies? Okay, it looks like a couple people are just getting their answers in here. All right. So it looks like, once again, fairly unanimous. About 3% said Atlantic Canada, about 3% said the East, 11% said the Boreal Shield, and 84% said the prairies.
And in fact, that's true. We conducted a survey of 1,009 beef producers across Canada. And when we look at the ratio of the number of cows grazing in winter versus the number grazing in summer, we can see the largest increase in winter grazing has occurred in the prairie region. And so therefore, with this increase in winter temperature that we expect, there may be several benefits. Things including longer growing season, which could mean higher yield of many of the crops that we use, for example, when we're stockpile grazing. That means that this warmer temperature will lead to decreased energy requirements for maintenance for cattle, which will decrease feed requirements and improve animal performance. And then finally, a more favorable environment for winter calving. However, along with those changes might come some increased challenges, and that includes things like increased freeze-thaw cycles, which could cause challenges with regards to crusted snow for winter grazing. What about the impact of severe weather on animal welfare and productivity? So certainly variations in temperature could lead to things like increased heat stress or increased cold stress, decreased productivity, and that these weather extremes are particularly challenging during calving and weaning season. And I've just given one example here about these, when we talk about extreme weather, we already talked about, the flooding in Alberta in 2013, but also things like in Manitoba, we had a tornado in Pearson in 2015, and it was the second longest recorded touchdown in North America. What about water? We say too much or too little water. So certainly in terms of animal use or animal consumption of water, we expect increased temperatures may lead to increased water requirements. What about crop and forage production? Longer growing seasons, perhaps, but even if we have no change in precipitation, higher temperatures will increase evapotranspiration, leading to greater water limitations. So I think we have to start thinking about opportunities to capture runoff and then store and use water for periods of deficit. What about the impact of climate change on feed supply? Certainly it's predicted that crops such as barley and canola will still dominate in the prairie region. But what about opportunities for warmer crops and specialty crops like soybean and corn? And certainly we've already seen those changes happen over time. If you look at the graph in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see if we look at corn for grain and corn for silage, we've seen increases in corn grain since 2006, but dramatic increases in the use of corn for silage. Potentially increases in other crops like sorghum and millet. And certainly breeding and technology will push these along even further. What about pests? And when I use the word pests, I mean anything that includes weeds, fungi, bacteria, and insects. What about as winter temperatures increase? Is there a potential for increase in overwintering of many of these pests, or the potential for rapid summer development and more generations? Other factors could include increased global trade for the possibility of moving insect pests, and then the resistance to pesticides. Certainly it will require increased vigilance and possibly new vaccination strategies. And I'm just going to give examples of a few. In the screen below the picture of the field, you see lungworm. And lungworm is a pest that can actually overwinter on pasture. And so that would certainly be one that would be in our view. Anaplasmosis is another disease that's caused by a parasite. And it is a parasite of red blood cells. And this parasite can be transmitted from animal to animal by ticks. In the diagram that you see here, in the map that you see here, this is the incidence of anaplasmosis from 1968 until 2011. And this is some work that's actually funded by the Beef Cattle Research Council by some researchers here at the University of Manitoba, as well as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge. The stars that you see depict the number of cases of anaplasmosis, and there was 5. This depicts 3 that occurred in the prairie region. And those 3, as well as the little green circle, are really, as you can see here, like I said, limited to the prairie region. And that was the only number of cases of anaplasmosis that occurred during that time frame from 1968 to 2009. However, between 2009 to 2011, there was a number of outbreaks or a number of incidences of anaplasmosis in eastern Manitoba. Now, as I said, anaplasmosis is transmitted by ticks. And this slide depicts the distribution of two ticks, the Rocky Mountain tick, which is predominant in the Western Canada, in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, and the American dog tick, which is primarily predominant in Manitoba. You'll see that there's a very clear area of sort of a habitat of both of those ticks with no overlap between them. A survey that was conducted by these same researchers in 2015 now shows that there's overlap of these two tick species, and that the habitat of those two tick species, as a consequence of warmer temperatures or supposed warmer temperatures, is leading to or can lead to an increase in potential transmission to cattle. Blue tongue is another one that is an insect-transmitted disease, and it is a problem particularly in sheep, but certainly can also impact cattle. And in 2015, it was only found in the Okanagan Valley. Since 2015, 3 animals from one farm in Ontario were found to have blue tongue. No subsequent cases have been found since, but certainly the midge, which is thought to be the vector, has been found in 2016. Two other diseases or pests that I want to talk about are anthrax. Anthrax is a disease for which the spores can survive in the soil for decades, and that during periods of either flooding or during drought, those spores can rise to the surface. And certainly we've seen cases of anthrax here in Manitoba. Another one that could be driven by changes in climate is liver flukes. And liver flukes have a snail as an intermediate host, and they tend to predominate in wet conditions. What about impact on processing? Certainly one of the greatest allies of food safety and processing plants is chilled process lines and wash water. And certainly in the industry, we have to think about innovative strategies to reduce energy and water use. And those changes are already beginning to occur. What about the impact of extreme weather and road closures, which could potentially have an effect on the fast food industry, which relies very heavily on frozen and refrigerated distribution chains? Certainly, climate change can impact transportation. Greater variability in temperature and precipitation that we've already talked about, as we said, could cause frequent freeze-thaw cycles and certainly cause deterioration in road infrastructure. Extreme weather with highway closures could cause costly interruptions in transport. And then even thinking about the potential for when we do have record crop yields, do we have the capacity for storage and transportation? And this graph depicts the catastrophic paid losses over time. So certainly here, if we look at just the dollars that are paid out as a consequence of these catastrophic events, we can see that they've been increasing over time. What about other impacts like insurance? Record claims of $3.2 billion in 2013, $2.6 billion was associated with catastrophic weather events. Certainly in terms of crop insurance on the prairies, we can say that claims typically for excess moisture have dominated, but excess drought as well. And certainly there could be implications in terms of higher insurance premiums. So we've talked about prairie agriculture being driven by changes in population, changes in weather, and changes in climate. But certainly we can expect that there'll be many other changes which occur, changes that we certainly, some of which we can model, as I said, with weather, climate, temperature, population, but many other changes which we necessarily can't always predict what will be. So if we think about it from a global perspective, other drivers of change, we know that Canada has an export-based production system, and that's certainly true of beef production. We can expect to see increased demand for bioproducts, and we certainly know that there's finite input resources, land, water use restrictions, for example, potential for increases in emerging disease, we just talked about some of them, but also societal pressure regarding management strategies. What about future growth? We've seen, for example, increases in regional trade agreements. Those include things, for example, like the signing of CETA last year, as well as we know that we'll expect to see increased demand for meat products in Asian markets. And this graph just depicts the prevalence of regional trade agreements over time. What about technology? We certainly know that the use of technology in the cattle industry has led to vast improvements in production efficiencies, and those include things like growth-promoting technologies as well as genomics. This is also some work that was funded by the Beef Cattle Research Council. And this graph looks at percentage change from 1981 to 2011, and some of the improvements that we've seen in animal performance over that time frame. We've seen 15% increase in reproductive efficiency, 20% increase in weaning weight of cattle, a 29% increase in steer weight, and a 45% increase in heifer weight. At that same period of time, we've also seen significant improvements in feed crop yields, a 23% increase in barley grain, 23% increase in barley silage production, a 61% increase in corn grain, and a 31% increase in corn silage. So what's been the consequence or the outcome of those changes? And as a result, we've seen a significant improvement in the carbon footprint. So a 15% improvement in the carbon footprint of cattle. And that's a good news story for the cattle industry to speak about. And in fact, BCRC has done just that. With research like this, they've actually been able to put together information that is available not only to cattle producers to be able to talk about the good news, but also to the general public in terms of changes in production efficiency that have led to decreases in greenhouse gas production. What about other drivers? And I think we're all mindful of public perception and how images like these certainly predominate in the popular media and are going to have a significant influence on public perception of our industry. Other drivers of change is government policy, for example. I think it's imperative that government policy is such that it not only can anticipate change, but it can enhance resilience or the adaptive capacity of the industry. And certainly it needs to be based on science policy, science-based policy. So we can think about how will adaptation of the industry occur. It can be incremental change, like biological efficiency, for example. And certainly we've seen improvements in feed efficiency. What about technology and certainly changes in manure management? Or societal, preference for different beef sourcing and different production systems. But certainly we also need to think about big shift changes. And one of those big shift changes is something like perennial grains. Stacey, I'd like to turn it over to you to again go back to the poll.
All right, so our next question here for going forward. So are you familiar with the concept of perennial grains? So fairly simple on this one, yes, no, or unsure. And I'm guessing by the time we are done this, you're all going to be able to answer yes. All right, so it looks like a couple of you are just getting your answers in. All right. So it looks like about 62% are, about 18% say no, and about 21% say they're not sure. So kind of split down the middle on that one.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. So this next slide is a brochure that's actually produced by General Mills Incorporated. And General Mills is as a strategy that they would like to incorporate the use of perennial grains into many of their food products as a strategy, as the slide implies, for new sustainable commercial grain crop. And so these perennial grains, and the one that we've been doing some work with here at the University of Manitoba, is intermediate wheatgrass. And they would like to use these perennial grains as part of, as I said, of products like granola bars and other things. But certainly there's some opportunities for the cattle industry. This next slide shows a perennial grain stand that was harvested for grain at the end of August and then fertilized, and this is the regrowth which occurred from the point of harvest until October. So certainly some of these big shift changes like perennial grains offer opportunities for the industry. What about changes in technology? And I'm going to use this term fake meat. So in the slide in front of you, you can see on the left-hand side an image of some cut-up meat on a plate. And that is actually a soy-based product that is promoted to have the taste and the texture that is very similar to pork and to chicken products. Another type of fake meat that's sort of on the horizon. On the right-hand side, you see an image of a burger. And that is actually a burger, a patty that has been produced from cultured meat. And that product, I think the value of it or the cost of it at present is cost prohibitive, but certainly it's something that's being researched. So when we think about these kinds of technologies, certainly they could potentially have an impact on the industry. And then obviously things that we've already seen happen in Europe, for example, things like the ban on antibiotic use. So we have to ask ourselves, is the cattle industry ready, or is the cattle industry prepared for some of these changes which are going to occur? And what are the tools that we need for successful adaptation? And some of those tools include things like investment in research. And certainly we've already seen the economic benefits of the Canadian beef checkoff. From 2011-12 to 2013-14, every checkoff dollar invested in research and marketing activities resulted in a cost-benefit ratio of 14:1, or a $14 benefit for Canadian cattle producers. Research had a benefit cost ratio of 34.5, and marketing had a benefit cost ratio of 13.5. What are some other tools for successful adaptation? Certainly we need to see innovation in terms of multi-sectoral investment and collaboration amongst the cow-calf, the feedlot, and the processing sector. And this is both in the short and in the long term. And this multi-sectoral investment has to be able to support incremental or big shift change. Certainly global knowledge and technology access will be important for us as an industry, as well as flexibility to adapt and integrate at the local level. One of the key I think tools of successful adaptation is also communication. And how do we communicate both within the industry and also with the general public? So Stacey, I'd like to turn it over to you once again to start the poll.
All right, so the last poll question here for you guys tonight. So this one you can select all that apply. So what are the preferred sources of information for you to get information for your farm? So farm print media, producer organizations, producer meetings, tours and field days, or online sources. So once again, select all that apply. So these ones take a little bit longer just because there's more answers for you to click on, so I'll give you guys a little bit more time. Okay, it looks like most of the answers are in, so I will close it. So for this one, they could select all that applied. So it looks like about 73% are from farm print media, 85% say online sources, 70% say tours or field days, 61% say producer organizations, and 52% say producer meetings.
Great, thanks, Stacey. So the average age of beef producers in Canada is approximately 54 years of age. Again, when we conducted this national survey of beef producers in Canada, they told us that the top sources of information were their own experience, farm print media, producer organizations, producer meetings, and demonstrations and field days. Interestingly, higher income producers had preferred sources of information, which included nutritionists, conference, workshops, and other specialized courses. Higher income producers also perceive themselves as more likely to take risks and to try new ideas. But regardless of the avenue, certainly information management is going to be key to successful adaptation for the industry. What other tools do we need for successful adaptation? I think education is paramount. And education includes knowledgeable, informed citizens, certainly in terms of having the capacity for analytical and critical thinkers, and that means that we need visionary leaders who can engage stakeholders, who can instill public trust, and who can support policies for successful adaptation. So successful adaptation for our industry is going to be more than conserving what once was. It will be more than surviving change, and it really must include the discovery of new opportunities. And I think we can clearly say that adaptation is already underway. If we talk about opportunities to engage in dialogue, the Canadian Beef Industry Conference last year was an excellent example of that. As Virgil just said, there was more than 650 conference registrants, and more than, I think, the number of registrants, for anybody who was there, it was just the momentum and the enthusiasm that was clearly felt at that meeting. The Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is another excellent example of how the cattle industry has been a leader in terms of when we talk about dialogue among stakeholders, and that includes stakeholders all across the sector. And certainly the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef Production has served as a model for many other roundtables which have now been underway. I think when we think about adaptation, we can certainly talk about other strategies that the industry has used to fill the toolbox. We've already talked about research investment from the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff, but also the Cattlemen's Young Leaders Program. We've talked about the need to have sort of strong industry leaders who can be a voice for the industry. And the last thing that we can think about is tell the story. And certainly we've heard that message over and over again as a strategy to instill public trust. So a few last thoughts before parting. We know that the future of our industry will include change. Climate change, which is maybe one of the changes that we can most readily predict, changes in technology, social change, and these wildcard changes which we can't even begin to imagine. But the industry has already demonstrated its capacity for adaptation. And I think we need to be mindful that education, innovation, and sound policy are key to successful adaptation for the future. Thanks very much, Stacey.
All right, thank you, Kim. That was fantastic. All right, so we'll now open it up to questions for everybody who's on tonight. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box in the side of your screen. If the window has closed, you should see an orange arrow at your screen. If you click on that orange arrow, it'll let you expand and you should be able to see the chat window that's there. Type in your questions and I will read them out to Kim. So the first question, we actually had one emailed in to us before the webinar here. So Kim, what advice do you have on grazing management and pasture species to offset some of the concerns with climate change?
So I think there's an abundance of research which shows that certainly forage quality is one of the drivers in terms of reducing enteric methane emissions. And what's really interesting to note is with this survey data that we had from beef producers across Canada, we actually we took 300 of the cow-calf operations from that overall survey, and we divided those operations into what we would call high emitters and low emitters. High emitters being high greenhouse gas production, low emitters being lower greenhouse gas production. And what's really striking is that the herds which were the low emitters were the same herds which had high production efficiency. So for producers, certainly reduction of greenhouse gases is a good news story because not only does it lend itself to increased production efficiency and obviously profitability, but at the same time decreased greenhouse gas production. And so forage quality, for example, is one of those things which is mutually beneficial in that not only does it serve to increase productivity, but also decrease greenhouse gas production.
All right, thanks. So the next question here, how can we set ourselves up for success when changing or when we know that unpredictable weather patterns are occurring?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And certainly I think just pre-planning as much as possible. But I think everybody who's ever, laid down hay and certainly had weather that doesn't cooperate is challenged. And I think that climate change is going to increase that to a greater extent, where we have these sort of extreme events. And so certainly I think that's going to be challenging for the industry. And just thinking about technologies that we can use, for example, if we're thinking about silage production and silage additives and things that are going to enhance the quality of forage, for example, so that we can not only, as I said, increase profitability, but reduce emissions.
All right, so I have one more question for Kim here. So if you do have any other questions, be sure to type them in. Just a reminder, you can type them into the chat window on the side of your screen on your control panel. If not, we'll end after this, but if you do have another question, be sure to get them in right away. So this next one here is about the perennial grains that you mentioned, and how do they compare nutritionally to other forages?
So we actually, in terms of the regrowth that I showed you, we haven't, the seed available for perennial grains is at present quite limited. And so we're just in the seed expansion phase. And that's some breeders in the Department of Plant Science. So we haven't had yet the opportunity to begin to analyze the forage in terms of looking at nutrient profile and then comparing it to other forage species. But certainly that's on the agenda in terms of once we continue to start to expand the seed capacity or seed availability, and then in terms of looking at it for forage productivity or as a forage source for cattle.
All right, thanks. So we have a couple more questions coming in here now. The first one, what are your thoughts on the beef industry surviving a fake or cultured meat movement?
Another excellent question. I think that the consuming public or many of the consuming public aren't necessarily or don't necessarily view artificial in terms of versus natural production systems. So I'm not sure personally that cultured meat is going to catch on in terms of people who are looking for a more natural or naturalized product. I think we can certainly see that, or have seen that consumers are very interested in seeing cattle grazing on pasture, and that something like that may be off-putting to many of them. However, I'm going to counter that comment by saying that we've seen significant promotion for things like Meatless Monday, for example, where consumers are certainly thinking about or there's promotion of these meatless events. So I'm not sure what the acceptance will be for future, but as I said, I think that these are things that are certainly on the horizon and that the industry needs to be mindful of in terms of positioning ourselves well.
All right, thanks. So the next question here, is there any research on harvesting a forage crop as silage versus hay and with respect to greenhouse gas emissions?
In terms of research focusing around hay versus silage, I think a lot of the research has certainly focused on looking at quality and being able to produce high quality forage, because when we look at low quality forage, so I'm going to just give some numerical examples here. So if we look at lower quality forage, we can talk about emissions that are 6 or 7% of gross energy intake. So that means that 6% or 7% of the energy associated with those forages is lost as methane. If we look at lower quality forages, approximately 10 or 11% of that forage energy is lost as methane. So certainly there's a lot of motivation to be able to produce, regardless of the mechanism of preservation, whether it's hay or silage, to be able to produce high quality forage.
All right, thanks. Another question here, and once again, we're kind of wrapping up with questions, so if you do have any pressing questions, be sure to get them in right away. Are there any other currently available perennial grains for livestock besides wheatgrass?
Not that I know of. So the organization or the institute that's been really doing a lot of work in perennial grains is focused in the Lands Institute. And the efforts of General Mills are to be able to promote the use of perennial grains, and that includes not only from a breeding perspective, but from an agronomic perspective, and all the way up to food science. How can we incorporate these perennial grains into products like noodles, for example, and even beer? So there's a small amount or a small sort of processing based on the limited amount of perennial grains that have been produced to date, but it's really quite limited, and that's where General Mills is really looking for expansion of those products and really investing in research in each of those areas.
All right, thank you very much. So it looks like that's all we have for questions for tonight. So just a couple more things to discuss here before I let you go for the night. So the first thing is how to get more information on science-based production advice through the BCRC. You can go to our website, beefresearch.ca. You can join our free email list, which I believe most of you already have. If you have a Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube account, you can also connect with us there as well. I just wanted to bring your attention to our next webinar, which will be held February 15th, and it will be on making forage mixtures work for you. So lots of great information for that one. Very shortly, as soon as the webinar ends, you're going to be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you're most interested in for future webinar topics. We do need your feedback as this helps us to do the best job we can to deliver information that's both useful and meaningful for you to be able to use on your operation. So please complete our survey and don't hesitate to contact me with any questions, comments, or suggestions at any time. You're also going to be receiving an email from me in a couple of days. It'll include a link to watch the recording as well as some links to additional information on climate change and the beef industry. So that's it. I would like to thank all of you at home for joining us tonight, and on behalf of everyone, thank you, Kim and Virgil, for volunteering your time tonight. Good night.
Thanks very much, Stacy.